let's just talk about DeepSeek. NVIDIA, the darling of the tech stocks, has been rattled. I think Monday it fell by 16%. This Chinese chatbot, cheaper version, if you like, has certainly rattled. What is the Howard-Marks take on the tech space now that DeepSeek has arrived?
Well, I don't have a take on the tech space. I don't know anything about tech. But I think is a really important lesson to be learned from the action yesterday. The interesting thing to me was that everything else was down big. I keep the stock prices of the companies in our industry on my phone, and they were all down big, including Brookfield. And markets all around the world have reflected this action. Why? The development with regard to DeepSeek, which put NVIDIA down so much, was very specific, a competitive threat to their activity. So why would anything else go down in sympathy? Why the investment manager stocks and so forth? And so what's the connection? What's the common thread? And the answer is psychology. And psychology is by far the dominant influence on investing in the short run. It has very little to do in the short run with fundamentals. How did yesterday's developments fundamentally affect all these other companies and industries and countries? And, I put out a memo earlier this month on the subject of bubbles. And I said in the this memo, that a bubble is not a period of rising prices, it's a period of temporary insanity. And if it were just objective, clinical, unemotional investors looking at NVIDIA, there would be no reason why yesterday's news should knock all these other things down. But it just shows you the pervasiveness of psychology and the irrationality of the markets in the short run.
But is it also valuations are very stretched? I mean, temporary insanity.
Oh, that's right. Yes, well, it's temporary insanity that leads to stretched valuations. But to me, the important thing is not the stretched valuations. It's how they got there. And it's through this loss of objectivity, which then you have to say to yourself, well, how is that affecting every other part of the market? Basically, we're supposed to be afraid of losing money, our own and our clients. But in a bubble, the bubbles go where they go because FOMO takes over from the fear of losing money. And, people become petrified that somebody else will be in something and they won't be in it. Kindleberger in the book Bubbles, Panics, Manias, and Crashes said there is nothing so injurious to your mental well-being as to watch your friend get rich. And that statement typifies the sentiment that takes over in a bubble. And so everybody should look at their holdings and try to make sure that the things they own based on strong and improving fundamentals, and not just and that they don't hold them just because they think they're going up. I think it's time to double check.
There's uncertainty about what's going to happen regarding tariffs. Obviously, that's going to weigh on the Fed guidance tomorrow. How should investors position themselves for the coming months?
What I say at Oaktree is that we try to find companies, we try to invest in companies that will grow and companies that will repay the money we lend them. That's the important thing, not what the Fed does or what the market does or what the administration does or something like that. In normal circumstances, you try to figure out what you think will happen that's important in the long run in, let's say, the political arena. But you have to admit today that we know less than usual about what the future holds in that regard. And I think that this administration is less predictable than most.
That's the problem, isn't it? It's unpredictable and uncertain.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if the members of the administration could predict what they're going to do a year from now. I certainly know I can't. We want tax cuts and smaller deficits, and we want to discourage imports and control inflation. And there are many ways in which the individual manifestations of the attitude are in conflict with each other. It's hard to find the common logic. So I think today we have to just watch to see how this administration's predilections determine its actions.
So let's start with the economy, which was a big driver in the recent election. What do you see moving forward?
I think the U.S. economy is functioning quite well. I think it's the best functioning economy in the world. Of course, our economy is often interconnected with others. So when they don't do great, it's hard for us to do great. But we are performing well and better than the others. I don't see areas of excess in our economy. You don't see overbuilding, too much inventory creation. You don't see a labor market that's too tight. It's excesses that necessitate later corrections. So I don't see that today. So, there's no reason to think we're going to be in recession soon. It's always a possibility if the spirit so moves consumers. But if we were to have a recession soon, I don't think it would necessarily be a serious one. I just think we're okay. We're in the middle ground of economic performance. And sometimes people might say, well, I wish it was really hot. When it's hot, then it can go cold. Right now, the status quo, I think, is very desirable.
It was exactly 25 years ago in January when you published the first memo entitled Bubble.com. And for the anniversary, you revisited that subject with a new memo titled On Bubble Watch. Tell us about the latest bubble memo and how things have evolved in this area over 25 years.
Well, let me clarify that a little bit.
Okay.
It's the 25th anniversary of the first memo that got some attention. I wrote for 10 years before I ever had a response. So I started writing memos in 90, but I wrote the first one that had a response in 2000. And that, as you say, was bubble.com. The .com era had dawned, and everybody was agog over anything related to the internet or e-commerce or telecom or tech. And we had a vast rise in the stock market. The S&P 500 stock index rose 20% a year throughout the 90s, which is probably, I'm sure it's the best decade in history. And it rose so high that it seemed like a bubble. I put out a memo called, as you say, bubble.com, January the 2nd of 2000. And then I thought it was timely to follow that up on January the 2nd, 2025, for the 25th anniversary, with another memo on the same topic, on Bubble Watch. And, everybody's always on the lookout for a bubble because they don't want to suffer when it ends. And so that's the topic of the memo. And, the stock market has done very well for the last 2.25 years. And certain stocks, there's a group of stocks called the Magnificent Seven. They're the 7 largest components of the S&P 500, to which there are 500 components. Those 7 out of the 500, so just over 1%, account for 40 some odd percent of the whole index. They're enormously overweighted and influential. And they've done exceptionally well, dragging the whole index with them. The rest of the index hasn't done so well. So now everybody wants to know if the S&P is in a bubble, the stock market in general, and specifically whether the Magnificent Seven are. And that's the subject of the memo. But I basically say in there that things are high, but it's not a bubble. There are two broad components to a bubble. One is high prices. You can argue that some of these things are highly priced. On the other hand, as I understand it, I'm not an expert because I don't invest in the stock market or in technology. These are wonderful companies. It's not, even though they're expensive, it's not arguable. It's not clear that they're too expensive. It's kind of like a Rolls Royce. It's a very expensive car, but it's a great car. And so you can't be sure that it's too expensive. So anyway, but these things, there are metrics we look at to see whether something is high priced or not. And the main one is called the price earnings ratio, PE ratio. And the price to earnings ratios on the Magnificent Seven or on the S&P as a whole are high relative to the norms, but not crazy. That's my bottom line. There's another important component in a bubble, and that's a psychological or emotional one. And I personally don't have reason to believe that that is present. So I've lived through a number of significant bubbles. I came into this business in September of '69 when the world was nutty about the so-called Nifty-50, and that was a mania. I saw it again in '99, the internet e-commerce bubble, mania. I don't think there's a mania today. There's enthusiasm, there's optimism. You might say that optimism is dominating the environment today. I wouldn't argue with that, but I don't think it's nutty. In '69 and in '99, what people said was, these are such great companies, there's no price too high. And so I define a bubble as a temporary mania. When people just don't stop applying reason and rationality to what they do. And I don't see that today. The prices are high. People discuss the fairness of the price, but I don't see anybody saying, there's no price too high.